Hello once again from the Prim Reaper. I know I was supposed to be doing Guilt as a Weapon this month as the next piece in my Insidious Aspects of Social Justice series, but some pretty serious family health problems have come up, and I have really had the wind taken out of me as a result. I think the Guilt video is a really important one, and I want to be able to do it justice, so I'm going to cheat a little bit this month if you're all willing to indulge me. I recently did a live stream on Honey Badger Radio where I talked a little bit about the idea of toxic masculinity and its supposed sister concept, toxic femininity. And I talked a little bit about why these concepts are, well, let's just say generously, a bit unbalanced. Now, I know many folks who watch my channel aren't necessarily acquainted with HBR, and I think that this is a good topic that warrants further discussion, so I thought I would sort of transfer ideas from that video here onto my channel and expand upon them a little bit in the interest of avoiding simply copying over the exact same thing. So, I have talked about toxic masculinity before on this channel and given a general overview of why I don't like it, but simply for the sake of contrast, I'm including another definition of it here. In modern society, people often use the term toxic masculinity to describe exaggerated masculine traits that many cultures have widely accepted or glorified. This harmful concept of masculinity also places significant importance on manliness based on strength, lack of emotion, self-sufficiency, dominance, and sexual virility. According to traditional toxic masculine values, a male who does not display enough of these traits may fall short of being a real man. Overemphasis of these traits may lead to harmful imbalances in someone trying to live up to these expectations. Some examples include aggression, sexual aggression or control, showing no emotion or suppressing emotions, hypercompetitiveness, needing to dominate or control others, a tendency towards or glorification of violence, isolation, low empathy, entitlement, chauvinism, and sexism. Now, let's immediately contrast this with the first thing I found when I searched for the idea of toxic femininity. But shelving the sarcasm for a moment, let's talk about some of the problems here. First of all, it doesn't take a cunning linguist to recognize that these are not even remotely fair definitions of concepts like this. Assuming, of course, you even want to believe these behaviors are sex-linked, or even that they must always be toxic behaviors to begin with, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. Yes, these seem like totally balanced and equivalent concepts, don't they? Let's just briefly summarize. Toxic masculinity, all the behaviors that display aggression, violence, and even hateful behavior towards others. Behaviors that are, apparently normalized, accepted, and even sometimes fostered by broader societal attitudes. Versus toxic femininity, all of the ways in which women are just so giving and generous of self, especially to men, that they just burn their poor little selves out and make themselves depressed. Wow, amazing. I'm sure that this is going to lead to a productive, good faith discussion where we can have civil discourse about the problematic elements of the behaviors of both sexes. It's obvious that the original concept of toxic masculinity pulls no punches when picking out behaviors it deems to be especially problematic as supposedly belonging to men or masculinity. However, the corresponding idea of toxic femininity really rather tiptoes gently around behavior from women, not that is toxic as coming from them, but behaviors that are, well, mostly pretty universally regarded as a positive. That is, empathy, patience, tenderness, and how these positive behaviors can become negative when used in excess. And again, not even negative towards others, but negative towards the poor women themselves. A definition like this is honestly pretty laughable, and it's indicative of what I believe is a much wider problem in our society: the absolute inability to reasonably and realistically confront any problem behaviors as long as they are coming from women. I mean, let's be real here. We can probably pretty easily come up with legitimately toxic behaviors that tend to come more from women than from men. Again, if we must link behaviors to the sexes, relational or passive aggression, helplessness, judgmental behavior, to name a few. Believe it or not, an article I found that was at least attempting to provide some legitimate examples of what might be called toxic femininity was Buzzfeed of all places. Not all of them are terribly good examples, mind you, but hey, they tried. Let's look at a few. Making fun of your female friends to try and get male attention. Also, just picking on and gossiping about other women in general, but then claiming you're all for women supporting women. Unfortunately, I've worked with a few women like this. Here we go. Being gossipy or catty is definitely a good example. Easy. Toxic femininity to me is when women shame men for being too soft or not adhering to their limited idea of masculinity. I dated a very short man for many years, and women would say the snarkiest things to me. They judged me for dating a man that wasn't bigger than me, because that's what a real man is supposed to look like according to them. Another great example. There's always so much criticism of toxic masculinity as a whole, but very little talk about what kinds of things tend to contribute to the development of these gender norms, and this is absolutely one such thing. I hate when women tear other women down for doing girly things. Some women do the "I'm not like other girls" thing to an extreme, so if you do like makeup or nails, you're automatically beneath women who choose not to do that because they're past all that. This here is a fine example of what I would call being too up in other people's business. And while I don't think that general idea is exclusively a female behavior, this specific example is a solid one. Telling another woman that she needs meat on her bones, or insulting her for not being curvy enough or flat-chested. Also, saying that she doesn't look like a real woman and that she looks like a boy. Body shaming applies to any type of body. This is indeed a good example I see coming, well, more from a specific subset of women, but I definitely see it more from women than men, and it is a solidly crappy behavior, so I'll give it a thumbs up. Toxic femininity equals being a Karen. A perfect and succinct example of what might be called toxic femininity, yes. But alas, before we go thinking that anything resembling even a mildly useful conversation came out of Buzzfeed, let's go ahead and look at the comments for a perfect example of the problem I was mentioning before. A lot of these are just examples of internalized misogyny or otherwise behavior produced by or reacting to the patriarchy. You don't need to make up terms like toxic femininity. Agree with the folks saying these examples are a result of internalized misogyny. The term toxic femininity shifts the blame away from the true culprit, the patriarchy. Women get blamed and criticized enough as it is. These are all just examples of women enforcing the existing patriarchy, lol, what the fuck? Toxic femininity is not a thing, stop. This article sucks. Toxic masculinity is doing toxic things to try to be masculine. These are just examples of shitty people or internalized misogyny, not women trying to be feminine. Each of these are wonderful examples of people tripping over themselves to excuse, justify, or otherwise hand-wave away women's bad behaviors, when I darn near guarantee they would never think to extend such a generous courtesy to men. The last comment is a particularly rich example of this, as I think it completely misses the point that a lot of what gets counted as belonging to the concept of toxic masculinity, most men probably would not in fact do because they are just trying to be masculine. Or at least that wouldn't be the main motivation behind what they're doing. Regardless, it feels like we as a society are just incapable now of holding women to any kind of standard of expectation for their conduct. You best not tell women what they should do or how they should be, because that would be controlling and misogynistic. You also better not tell women how they ought not to be either, because generally women only behave badly because of the misogynistic and patriarchal systems they're forced to live in, and otherwise they are inherently perfect angels incapable of doing any wrong. I know I exaggerate a little bit, but not by much. It's easy to find examples of women committing heinous behavior that they get a slap on the wrist for, or people clamoring to come up with excuse after excuse for why what they did really isn't all that bad. Or you have cases like the comments on the site I just went over claiming that behaviors commonly seen in women are not truly women's fault, or even fully within their control. It's embarrassing, patronizing, and frankly, I don't think it speaks very highly of women's ability to truly be equal to men if we can't occasionally take a good hard look in the mirror at ourselves and make necessary criticisms and changes to our behaviors as needed, especially when so many women have been relentlessly demanding that men do that very thing over the past several years. Moving on to the next point of discussion, another thing that I usually criticize whenever this topic comes up, the issues with associating problematic behaviors with a given sex rather than just focusing on the problem behavior itself. Someone who has a problem with hyper-competitiveness or sexual aggression is not displaying toxic masculinity. They just have a problem with hyper-competitiveness or sexual aggression. Nor, under any reasonable line of thinking, should anyone consider someone who works to the benefit of others to the detriment of themselves to be having a toxic femininity problem, whether they are a woman or a man. After all, acting as though women are not capable of aggression, violence, and hateful behavior, or that men are not capable of giving so much of themselves that they burn out, is so ignorant that I honestly have trouble fathoming it. Even if someone does not personally know of a woman or a man like these, it's really not difficult to find examples of them. Should this not be enough to show that these concepts are extremely flawed? Or are we just meant to state that the men and women in these scenarios are just displaying the toxic gendered behavior of the other sex? As if that's not even more insulting and ridiculous. Go ahead and tell any group of women that an exceptionally patient and empathetic male boss who burns himself out trying to care for his employees is displaying toxic femininity, and just watch what happens. Going another layer deeper into this discussion is assuming that all of these examples of behaviors we have talked about are even necessarily always toxic to begin with. I've already talked about examples like limiting emotion or stoicism in the toxic masculinity video, but even things that would seem to be obviously toxic can have some positive sides or be adaptive in certain contexts. Hypercompetitiveness can lead to successes in the business world. Wanting to control others in a certain sense could result in leadership qualities. Giving of oneself to the point of self-sacrifice could be the difference in one's partner breaking down during a difficult time. To say nothing of the surrounding contexts that may be facilitating the development of many of these behaviors. If a little boy grows up in a household with an abusive single mother who beats him and with peers who belittle him and becomes isolated, or a young man who is rejected by all his romantic prospects for showing too much emotion becomes emotionless and domineering, is it his masculinity that is toxic, or is it the environment that influenced him to become that way? Similarly, if a girl grows up being bullied or judged by her family and then grows up to be a judgmental bully to others, or another girl is raised by, infirm grandparents for whom she has to do everything while also still trying to maintain her own welfare, and this behavior carries forward into her future relationships. Are these behaviors a function of the femininity itself, or is it again just a product of the contexts of their lives? And I can almost envision people jumping to say, but we never claimed these behaviors were toxic all the time. But I think that if that were the case, we wouldn't have these needlessly reductive concepts like toxic masculinity or toxic femininity, under which we list a subset of behaviors we consider to be toxic, because that would almost certainly lead to assumptions about the behaviors or concepts being toxic in general, rather than acknowledging the complexity and contextual factors that lead to a behavior being toxic or not. But unfortunately, we all know that talk like that involves too much brain power. What's worse, if we were to just look at problematic behaviors as they manifest in an individual's life in the context of their circumstances, without trying to apply that behavior to one of the immutable categories to which they belong, we might have to accept the fact that both men and women are capable of being good or bad people, regardless of their sex. We wouldn't want that, would we? Thanks so much for watching, and I hope to see you all in the next one.